EYELESS in GAZA by Aldous Huxley. Chapter 18. December 8th, 1926. More guests kept arriving, young people mostly, friends of Joyce and Helen. Dutifully, they crossed the drawing-room to the far corner where Mrs. Amberley was sitting between Beppo Bowles and Anthony, said good evening, then hurried off to dance. "They put one in one's middle-aged place, all right," said Anthony, but either Mrs. Amberley preferred not to hear the remark, or else she was genuinely absorbed in what Beppo was saying with such loud, fizzling enthusiasm about Berlin, the most amusing place in Europe nowadays. Where else would you find, for example, those special tarts for masochists? In top boots, yes, genuine top boots, and the Museum of Sexology, such photographs and wax models almost too trompe l'oeil. Okay, what? What? These, the way. God damn it. Here we go again. Spelled TROMPE hyphen L apostrophe, right? And then it's either CEIL or OEIL. You can't fucking tell because they've pushed the whichever one of those letters it is right up against this E, so you can't fucking tell which is which. So what the fuck, man? No wonder they... Okay. So... Okay, we're just gonna run through it. And the Museum of Sexology, such photographs and wax models almost to tromper le ciel. Such astounding objects in horn from Japan, such strange and ingenious tailoring for exhibitionists, and all those delicious little lesbian bars, all those cabarets where the boys were dressed up as women. There's Mark Staithes and Mrs. Amberley, interrupting him, and waved to a shortish, broad-shouldered man who had just entered the drawing-room. "I forget," she said, turning to Anthony, "whether you know him." "Only for the last 30 years," he answered, finding once again a certain malicious pleasure in insisting, to the point of exaggeration, on his vanished youth. If he were no longer young, then Mary had ceased to be young 9 years ago. But with long gaps, he qualified. During the war, and then afterwards, for all that time he was in Mexico. And I've hardly had more than a glimpse of him since he came back. I'm delighted to have this chance." "He's a queer fish," said Mary Amberley, thinking of the time just after his return from Mexico, some 18 months before, when he had first come to her house. His appearance, his manner, as of some savage and fanatical hermit, had violently attracted her. She had tried all her seductions upon him without the smallest effect. He had ignored them, but so completely and absolutely that she felt no ill will towards him for the rebuff, convinced as she was that in fact there hadn't been any rebuff, merely a display of symptoms, either she diagnosed judicially of impotence, or else, less probably, though of course one never knew of homosexuality. A queer fish, she repeated, and decided that she'd take the next opportunity of asking Beppo about the homosexuality. He would be sure to know. They always did know about one another. Then, waving again, "Come and sit with us, Mark," she called through the noise of the gramophone. Staithes crossed the room, drew up a chair, and sat down. His hair had retreated from his forehead, and above the ears was already grey. The brown face, that fanatical hermit's face, with Mary Amberley had found so strangely attractive, was deeply lined. No smooth, obliterating layer of fat obscured its inner structure. Under the skin, each strip of muscle in the cheek and jaw seemed to stand out distant. Under the skin, each strip of muscle in the cheek and jaw seemed to stand out distinct and separate, like the muscles in those lime wood statues of flayed human beings that were made for Renaissance anatomy rooms. When he smiled, and each time that happened, it was as though the flayed statue had come to life and were expressing its agony, one could follow the whole mechanism of the excruciating grimace, the upward and outward pull of the zygomachus. One could follow the whole mechanism of the excruciating grimace, the upward and outward pull of the zygomaticus major, the sideways tug of the risorius, the contraction of the great sphincters round the eyelids. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, looking with sharp, inquisitorial movements from one to the other. "Beppo was telling us about Berlin," said Mrs. Amberley. "I popped over to get away from the general strike," Beppo explained. "Naturally," said Staithes, and his face twitched in anguish of amused contempt. "Such a heavenly place," Beppo exploded irrepressibly. "You feel like Lord Haldane about it." "Your spiritual home?" "Carnal," Anthony amended. "Only too happy to plead guilty," Beppo giggled. "Yes, those travestites taste... What the fuck is that?" "Hold on a fucking minute." "Only too happy to plead guilty," Beppo giggled. "Yes, those transvestitists," he had to admit rapturously. "I was over there this winter," said Staithes, "on business, but of course one has to pay one's tribute to pleasure too. That nightlife. Didn't you find it amusing?" "Oh, passionately." "You see," Beppo was triumphant. "One of the creatures came and sat at my table," Staithes went on. "I danced with it. It looked like a woman." "You simply can't tell them apart," Beppo cried excitedly, as though he were taking personal credit for the fact. "When we'd finished dancing, it painted its face a bit, and we drank a little beer. Then it showed me some indecent photographs, that rather surgical anti-aphrodisiac kind, you know, damping. Perhaps that was why the conversation flagged. Anyhow, there were uncomfortable silences. Neither it nor I seemed to know what to say next. We were becalmed." He threw out his two thin and knotted hands horizontally, as though sliding them across an absolutely flat surface, utterly becalmed, until suddenly the creature did a most remarkable thing, one of its regular gambits, no doubt, but never having had it played on me before, I was impressed. "Would you like to see something?" it said. I said yes, and immediately it began to poke and pull at something under its blouse. "Now look," it said at last. I looked. It smiled triumphantly, like a man playing the ace of trumps, or rather playing two aces of trumps, for what it plunked down on the table was a pair of superb artificial breasts made of pink rubber sponge. "But how revolting!" cried Mrs. Amberley, while Anthony laughed, and Beppo's round face took on an expression of pained distress. "How revolting!" she repeated. "Yes, but how satisfactory!" Staithes insisted, making that crooked and agonized grimace that passed with him for a smile. "It's so good when things happen as they ought to happen, artistically, symbolically." Two rubber breasts between the beer mugs. That's what vice ought to be. And when that was what it actually was, well, it felt as though something had clicked into place, inevitably, beautifully. "Yes, beautifully," he reported. "Yes, beautifully," he repeated. "Beautifully revolting." "All the same," Beppo insisted, "you must admit there's a lot to be said for a town where that sort of thing can happen. In public," he added earnestly. "In public, mind you. It's the most tolerant in the world, the German government. You've got to admit that." "Oh, I do," said Staithes. "It tolerates everybody. And not only girls in boiled shirts and boys with rubber breasts, but also monarchists, fascists, junkers, Krupps, communists, too. I'm thankful to say all its enemies of every color. It tolerates everybody, not only girls in boiled shirts and boys with rubber breasts, but also monarchists, fascists, junkers, Krupps, communists, too. I'm thankful to say all its enemies of every color." "I think that's rather fine," said Mrs. Amberley. "Very fine indeed, until its enemies rise up and destroy it." "I only hope the communist will get in first." "But seeing that they're tolerated, why should its enemies want to destroy it?" "Not? Why not?" "They don't believe in tolerance." "Quite rightly," he added. "You're barbarous," Beppo protested. "As one should be if one lives in the Dark Ages. You people, you're survivors from the age of Antonines." He looked from one to the other, smiling his flayed smile, and shook his head, imagining you're still in the first volume of Gibbon, whereas we're well on in the third. "Do you mean to say—" "But good heavens!" Mrs. Amberley interrupted herself. "There's Jerry." At her words, at the sight of Jerry Watchett himself, fox-trotting in from the back drawing-room with Helen, Anthony took out his pocket-book and quickly examined its contents. "Thank God," he said. "Only £2. Jerry had caught him with the 10 the previous month, and on the strength of a most improbably distressing story, borrowed them all. He ought to have disbelieved the story, of course, ought to have withheld the loan. £10 were more than he could afford. He had said so, but had lacked the firmness to persist in his refusal. It had taken more than a fortnight of strict economy to make up the lost money. Economizing was an unpleasant process, but to say no and to go on saying it in the teeth of Jerry's importunities and reproaches would have been still more unpleasant. He was always ready to sacrifice his rights to his conveniences. People thought him disinterested, and he would have liked, he did his best to accept their diagnosis of his character. But awareness of the real state of affairs kept breaking through. When it did, he accepted self-knowledge with a laugh. He was laughing now. Only two, he repeated. Luckily, I can afford. He broke off behind Mary's back. Beppo had tapped him on the shoulder, was making significant grimaces. Anthony turned and saw that she was still staring intently and with knitted brows at the new arrivals. He told me he wasn't coming this evening, she said, almost as though she were speaking to herself. Then, through the music, Jerry, she called sharply, in a voice that had suddenly lost all its charm, a voice that reminded Anthony only too painfully of those distasteful scenes in which long since he had played his part. So that was it, he said to himself, and felt sorry for poor Mary. Gary Watchett turned, and with the expression of one who refers to some excellent shared joke, gave her a quick smile and even a hint of a wink, then looked down again to go on talking to his partner. Mrs. Amberley flushed with sudden anger, grinning at her like that. It was intolerable, too, but how typical, to appear like this, unannounced, out of the blue, casually dancing with another woman, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. This time it was true, the other woman was only Helen, but that was merely because he hadn't found anyone else to dance with, anyone worse. The beast, she thought, and she followed him round the room with her eyes. Then, making an effort, she looked away. She forced herself to pay attention to what was going on around her. A country like this, Mark Staithes was saying, a country where a quarter of the population's genuinely bourgeois and another quarter passionately longs to be. You're exaggerating, Anthony protested. Not a bit. What does the Labour Party poll at an election? A third of the votes. I'm generously assuming it might someday poll half of them. The rest bourgeois. Either naturally bourgeois by interest and fear, or else artificially by snobbery and imagination. It's childish to think you can get what you want by constitutional methods. And what about unconstitutional ones? There's a chance. Not much of a chance, said Anthony. Not against the new weapons. Oh, I know, said Mark Staithes. I know. If they use their strength, the middle classes can obviously win. They could win, most likely, even without tanks and planes, just because they're potentially better soldiers than the proletariat. Better soldiers? Beppo protested, thinking of those guardman friends of his. Because of their education, a bourgeois gets anything from 10 to 16 years of training, most of it, what's more, in a boarding school. That's to say, in barracks, whereas a workman's child lives at home and doesn't get more than 6 or 7 years at his day school. 16 years of obedience and esprit de corps. No wonder that Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. If they'll use only half their resources, use them ruthlessly, the game's theirs. You think they won't use their resources? Mark shrugged his shoulders. Certainly the German Republicans don't seem ready to use theirs. And think of what happened here during the strike. Even the majority of industrialists were ready to compromise. For the simple reason, Anthony put in, that you can't be a successful industrialist unless you have the compromising habit. A business isn't run by faith, it's run by haggling. Anyhow, Mark went on, the fact remains that the available resources weren't used. That's what allows one to hope that a revolution might succeed, provided it were carried out very quickly. For, of course, once they realized they were seriously in danger, they'd forget their scruples. But they might hesitate long enough, I think, to make a revolution possible. Even a few hours of compunction would be sufficient. Yes, in spite of tanks, there's still a chance of success. But you may be prepared to take a chance, not like the imbeciles of the TUC or the rank and file of the unions, for that matter, as full of scruples as the bourgeoisie. It's the hangover of the evangelical Christianity. You've no idea what a lot of preaching and hymn singing there was during the general strike. I was flabbergasted. But it's good to know the worst. Perhaps the younger generation. He shook his head. But I don't feel certain even of them. Methodism may be decaying. But look at those spiritualist chapels that are sprouting up all over the industrial areas, like toadstools. The next time he passed, Jerry called her name, but Mary Amberley refused to acknowledge his greeting. Turning coldly away, she pretended to be interested only in what Anthony was saying. Ass of a woman, thought Jerry, as he looked at her averted face. Then aloud, what do you say to putting on this record another time? He asked his partner. Helen nodded ecstatically. The music of the spheres, the beatific vision. But why should heaven be a monopoly of ear or eye? The muscles, as they move, they too have their paradise. Heaven is not only an illumination and a harmony, it is also a dance. Half a tick, said Jerry, when they were opposite the gramophone. Helen stood there, as he wound up the machine, quite still, her arms hanging limp at her sides. Her eyes were closed. She was shutting the world away from her, shutting herself out of existence. In this still vacancy between two heavens and motion, existence was without a point. The music stopped for a moment, then began again, in the middle of the bar. Behind her closed eyelids, she was aware that Jerry had moved, was standing over her, very near. Then his arm encircled her body. Onward, Christian soldiers, he said, and they stepped out once more into the music, into the heaven of harmoniously moving muscles. Onward, Christian soldiers, he said, and they stepped out once more into the music, into the heaven of harmoniously moving muscles. There had been a silence. Determined not to pay any attention to that beast, Mrs. Amberley turned to Staithes. And those scents of yours? She asked with an assumption of bright amused interest. Flourishing, he answered. I've had to order 3 new stills and take on more labor. Mrs. Amberley smiled at him and shook her head. You of all people, she said. It seems peculiarly ridiculous that you should be a scent manufacturer. Why? The most unfrivolous of men, she went on, the least gallant, the most implacable misogynist. Either impotent or homosexual, there couldn't be a doubt, and after his story about Berlin, almost certainly impotent, she thought, with a smile of excruciated mockery. But hasn't it occurred to you, Staithes asked, that those might be reasons for being a scent-maker? Reasons? A way of expressing one's lack of gallantry. In point of fact, it was entirely by chance that he had gone into the scent business. His eye had been caught by an advertisement in the Times. A small factory for sale very cheap. Just luck. But now, after the event, it heightened his self-esteem. To say that he had chosen the profession deliberately in order to express his contempt for the women for whom he catered. The lie, which he had willed and by this time half believed to be the truth, placed him in a position of superiority to all women in general, and at this moment to Mary Amberley in particular. Leaning forward, he took Mary's hand, raised it as though he were about to kiss it, but instead only stiffened at the skin, then let it fall again. Leaning forward, he took Mary's hand, raised it as though he were about to kiss it, but instead only sniffed at the skin, then let it fall again. For example, he said, there's civet in the stuff you've scented yourself with. Oh, no reason. Well, why not? Oh, no reason at all, said Staithes. No reason at all if you happen to have a taste for the excrement of polecats. Mrs. Amberley made a grimace of disgust. In Abyssinia, he went on, they have civet farms. Twice a week you take a stick and go and poke the cats until they're thoroughly angry and frightened. That's when they secrete their stuff, like children wetting their knickers when they're afraid. Then you catch them with a pair of tongs so that they can't bite, and scrape out the contents of the little pouch attached to their genital organs. You do it with an egg spoon, and the stuff's a kind of yellow grease, rather like earwax. Stinks like hell when it's undiluted. We get it in London packed in buffalo horns. Huge cornucopias full of dark brown stinking earwax at 117 shillings the ounce. What's more, at 117 shillings the ounce, what's more. That's one of the reasons why your scent costs you so much. The poor can't afford to smear themselves with cat's mess. They have to be content with plain isoeugonal and phenyl acetic aldehyde. Colin and Joyce had stopped dancing and were sitting on the landing outside the drawing-room door. Alone, it was Colin's opportunity for releasing some of the righteous indignation that had been accumulating within him ever since dinner-time. "I must say, Joyce," he began, "some of your mother's guests—" Joyce looked at him with eyes in which there was anxiety as well as adoration. "Yes, I know," she apologized. "I know," and was abjectly in a hurry to agree with him about Beppo's degeneracy and Anthony Bevis's cynicism. Then, seeing that he was enjoying his indignation and that she herself rather profited than suffered by it, she even volunteered the information that that man who had come in last was sitting with her mother, was a Bolshevik. Yes, Mark Staithes was a Bolshevik. The phrase that Colin had been meditating all the evening found utterance. "I may be stupid and all that," he said with an assumption of humility that cloaked an overweening self-satisfaction in what he regarded as the quite extraordinary quality of his ordinariness. "I may be ignorant and badly educated, but at least," his tongue changed, he was proudly giving expression to his consciousness of being uniquely average, "at least I know, well, I do know what's done. I mean, if one's a gentleman, he underline the words to make them sound slightly comic, and so prove that he had a sense of humor, to speak seriously of what one took seriously. This precisely was one of the things that wasn't done. That touch of humor proved more cogently than any emphasis could do, any emotional trembling of the voice, that he did take these things seriously, as a uniquely average gentleman must take them, and of course Joyce understood that he did. She glanced at him worshippingly and pressed his hand. Dancing, dancing. Oh, if only, thought Helen, one could go on dancing forever. If only one didn't have to spend all that time doing other things, wrong things, mostly stupid things, things one was sorry for after they were done. Dancing, she lost her life in order to save it, lost her identity and became something greater than herself, lost her perplexity and self-hatreds in a bright, harmonious certitude, lost her bad character and was made perfect, lost the regretted past, the apprehended future, and gained a timeless present of consummate happiness. She who could not paint, could not write, could not even sing in tune, became, while she danced, an artist, no more than an artist, became a god, the creator of a new heaven and a new earth, a creator rejoicing in his creation and finding it good. Yes, sir, she's my baby. No, sir, Jerry broke off, his humming. I won £60 at poker last night, he said. Pretty good, eh? She smiled up at him and nodded in rapturous silence. Good, good. Everything was wonderfully good. And I can't tell you, Staithes was saying, how intensely I enjoy writing those advertisements. The muscles in his face were working as though for an anatomical demonstration. The ones about bad breath and body odors. Hideous, Mrs. Amberley shuddered. Hideous. There's only one Victorian convention I appreciate, and that's the convention of not speaking about those things. Which is precisely why it's such a fun to speak about them, said Staithes, beaming at her between contracted sphincters, forcing humans to be fully verbally conscious of their own and other people's disgustingness. That's the beauty of this kind of advertising. It shakes them into awareness. And into buying, put in Anthony. You're forgetting the profits. Staithes shrugged his shoulders. They're incidental, he said, and it was obvious, Anthony reflected, as he watched him, it was obvious that the man was telling the truth. For him, the profits were incidental. Breaking down your protective convention, he went on, turning again to Mary. That's the real fun. Leaving you defenseless against the full consciousness of the fact that you can't do without your fellow humans, and that, when you're with them, they make you sick.